The chamber froze in an instant. Tim Scott leaned forward, his voice sharpened to a blade, delivering a dismissive jab at Jasmine Crockett that sliced through the room with calculated precision. It wasn't just a critique, it was the kind of remark meant to diminish, to belittle, to remind her of where he thought she stood. His words hung heavy in the air, and for a breathless moment, no one moved. Cameras clicked like distant thunder. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the marble walls seemed to vibrate with the tension of that strike. Around the chamber, aides shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that said what their lips dared not. Did he really just say that? The atmosphere thickened with an almost electric charge. Tim Scott allowed himself a fleeting smirk, the look of a man convinced he had seized the spotlight, that his words would echo louder than any reply. In his mind, the duel was over before it began. But across the table, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her eyes locked on him with a calm intensity, a stillness that unsettled more than any shouted retort ever could. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and suspenseful, until it seemed the entire chamber leaned toward her, waiting for what would come next. And then, like a heartbeat breaking through the hush, the thought reverberated across the nation. The moment Tim Scott thought he had the upper hand? But what happened next left the nation in awe. Because what followed wasn't politics as usual. It wasn't a mere rebuttal to a colleague's remark. It was the spark of something larger, a challenge, a statement, a thunderclap in the culture of American debate. But Crockett's response wasn't just a comeback, it was a cultural thunderclap. This was never just about two lawmakers trading barbs in a crowded chamber. The clash between Tim Scott and Jasmine Crockett cut into something deeper. Something raw that sits at the center of American politics. Here was a black woman, younger, bolder, unapologetically herself, facing off against a senator who carried the polish of establishment confidence. On the surface, it looked like a debate, but beneath it pulsed the eternal struggle of representation, identity, and power. For too long, voices like Crockett's have been brushed aside, told to wait their turn, as if leadership were a privilege reserved for the already powerful. Her very presence in that room challenged a hierarchy that still too often underestimates women, especially women of color. When Scott's words dripped with dismissal, it wasn't only Crockett he tried to put in her place. It was every woman who's been told she was too emotional, every immigrant family dismissed as un-American, every voice told to lower its volume to protect someone else's comfort. And that's why the air felt different that day. The cameras weren't just recording another committee spat. They were capturing a cultural moment in the making. Crockett, underestimated yet unshaken, sat poised like a storm about to break. She carried with her the weight of those stereotypes and the fire to shatter them. Already, whispers had begun outside those walls. Reporters texted their editors. Something's happening here. Producers leaned toward their monitors. Keep the tape rolling. Because deep down, everyone could sense it. The kind of moment that doesn't just land in tomorrow's news cycle, but rewrites it. And here was the secret FOMO trigger. Millions of people, scrolling on their phones, would soon stumble upon the clip and realize they were witnessing history. The kind of exchange replayed endlessly, dissected on podcasts, looped, on TikTok, transformed into memes, and celebrated as a cultural turning point. Tim Scott thought he had delivered the final word. But the energy in that chamber suggested otherwise. Something bigger was rising, swelling like a wave that could no longer be ignored. Viewers thought the exchange was over, until Crockett leaned forward. To understand the weight of Tim Scott's jab, you have to understand the man behind it. On paper, Scott carries the polish of a seasoned politician. Sharp suits, practiced smiles, speeches that roll off the tongue, as if engineered for cable news soundbites. He presents himself as the embodiment of American optimism, the story of a man who rose from modest beginnings to the highest chambers of power. He often speaks of unity, of tearing down divisions, of being the bridge in a fractured nation. But beneath that polish lies a contradiction that has never gone unnoticed. For all his talk of unity, Scott has built a reputation for dismissing voices that don't fit his vision of respectability. His optimism, while inspiring to some, often feels detached, disconnected from the struggles that so many Americans face daily. When workers cry out about poverty wages, when immigrants plead for dignity, when women demand respect, Scott's answers have often leaned more towards scolding than solidarity. Critics have long said he confuses civility with silence, expecting the marginalized to endure injustice quietly, politely, without disturbing the order of the room. He has preached about overcoming barriers, yet in moments like the one with Jasmine Crockett, he reveals a tendency to push others back into those very barriers. His unity, it seems, has limits, and those limits surface when someone refuses to play by rules written to keep them small. Moments of arrogance have punctuated his career. The time he brushed aside a colleague's plea for urgency on racial justice, reminding them to focus on the bigger picture. The committee hearing where he laughed off pointed questions, leaning into condescension instead of substance. Time and again, he has underestimated opponents, assuming his status and polish were shields that could not be pierced. And so, when he launched his verbal strike at Crockett, it was part of a familiar pattern, the polished senator asserting dominance, confident his words would go unchallenged, that the cameras would favor him, that the audience at home would nod along. But what he failed to see was the growing fatigue. Millions tired of polished dismissals, tired of civility masking arrogance, tired of being told to stay quiet while others rewrote their stories. Tim Scott believed he was the one controlling the narrative, the one writing the script in which Jasmine Crockett would play the supporting role, quiet and chastened. What he did not see was the steel in her eyes, the resilience honed by years of fighting battles he could only intellectualize from a podium. Because arrogance, for all its confidence, comes with one fatal flaw. It blinds. It blinds to the moment when the tide shifts. It blinds to the silence that isn't submission, but suspense. It blinds to the storm gathering just across the table. But arrogance has a way of blinding you to the storm about to break. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever sat across from Tim Scott, long before the cameras and the headlines, she was a fighter born of necessity. Her story was not scripted in marble halls, but written in late nights, crowded courtrooms, and the relentless grind of proving herself in a system that wasn't built to welcome her. Raised in a world where expectations were often defined by limits, Crockett learned early that survival meant resilience, and that resilience could one day become power. Her rise began not with speeches, but with action. As a young attorney, she took on cases others avoided, defending those without the money, influence, or connections to secure justice. Courtrooms became battlegrounds, where she faced not only opposing counsel but the weight of assumptions that whispered she was too young, too brash, too black, too female. Each trial became a test, each ruling a reminder of how high the hurdles were stacked, yet with every victory she carved a space that no dismissal could erase. Those who knew her from those days describe a relentless energy. She did not merely argue. She embodied the cause of those she represented. Her authenticity made her clients believe, even when the odds were impossible. Judges, colleagues, even rivals began to notice that Crockett was not a politician in waiting. She was a warrior already in motion. And it was from that crucible of struggle that her political life was forged. When she entered public office, she carried with her the courtroom's sharp edge and the community's unshakable trust. She was not polished in the way Washington prefers, and she didn't need to be. She was raw, real, and unafraid to speak in the rhythms of the people she represented. For supporters, that honesty was refreshing. For opponents, it was threatening. Yet with every step upward, the stereotypes shadowed her path. Whispers in corridors. She's too loud. Commentators on cable panels. She's too confrontational. Anonymous voices online. She doesn't belong. But Crockett understood something her critics didn't. The very traits they mocked were the ones that made her unbreakable. Loud meant refusing to be ignored. Confrontational meant refusing to accept injustice politely. And belonging? She knew she didn't just belong. She was proof that America's promise was bigger than any one definition of power. Every barrier she faced, every dismissal she endured, was training. The courtroom battles taught her to dissect arrogance without raising her voice. The long nights of grassroots activism taught her that truth has more staying power than polish. The constant underestimation became fuel, sharpening her words into weapons of clarity and conviction. So when the moment came, When Tim Scott aimed to diminish her with a smirk and a cutting remark, Crockett was not caught off guard. She had been here before, though the faces and settings had changed. She had stood across from men who assumed their status guaranteed their victory. She had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that her voice did not carry the same weight. And every time she had answered not with retreat but with fire. This clash, then, was not an interruption in her story. It was the continuation of it. She was ready, not because she rehearsed for this specific insult, but because her life had been one long preparation for moments just like this. And so, when Tim Scott tried to silence her, Crockett's fire was already lit. The air inside the chamber felt charged, as if every molecule carried static. Tim Scott's words still lingered, sharp and dismissive, when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward. Her posture alone shifted the atmosphere. What began as a calculated jab from Scott now teetered on the edge of something larger, something dangerous for him. Scott tried to press his advantage, interrupting with clipped phrases meant to cut her off before she could gain momentum. His voice grew sharper, the tempo faster, as if speed could smother the rising energy in the room. But each time he interjected, Crockett remained unshaken. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. Instead, she sat with a calm that was almost unnerving, letting his interruptions hang in the air like echoes that only weakened with repetition. Observers felt the shift. The senator's polish was beginning to crack. His carefully rehearsed composure frayed at the edges as Crockett's silence grew louder than his words. He adjusted his notes. He cleared his throat. He glanced around the chamber as though searching for confirmation that he still controlled the moment. But the room knew better. The energy belonged to her now. The audience leaned in, the hush swelling with anticipation. The cameras zoomed closer, framing every flicker of expression. It was the kind of silence that grips before a thunderclap. The stillness that tells you something unforgettable is about to erupt. Every breath taken in that chamber seemed to hang, suspended, as if the entire nation waited for release. And just when it seemed Scott had regained his balance, just when he prepared to barrel forward again, the silence broke. Then Crockett struck. Her voice cut through the silence like a sudden bell. Calm, measured, deliberate, Jasmine Crockett began not with fury, but with precision. "Senator," she said, her tone steady yet edged with unmistakable resolve, "it's easy to dismiss someone when you've never had to fight for your seat at the table." The words landed heavy, and the room reacted with a low ripple of murmurs. Scott shifted in his chair, his smirk faltering, though he tried to mask it with a quick shuffle of his papers. Crockett pressed on, each line sharper than the last, like a blade carefully carving away at his facade. "You speak of unity," she continued, pausing just long enough for the silence to deepen. "But what you really mean is conformity. You ask us to be silent so that your version of America feels comfortable. But silence has never delivered justice. Silence has never built bridges. Silence has never set anyone free." Gasps punctuated her words. A few in the audience stifled laughter, not at her, but at the unraveling of Scott's composure. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Crockett's cadence grew stronger, the rhythm almost musical, rising and falling with the energy of the room. "For generations," she said, leaning slightly forward, "voices like mine were told to wait. Wait for the right time, wait for the right tone, wait until it was convenient for men in power to finally listen. Well, Senator, we've waited long enough, and the truth doesn't need your permission to be spoken." Scott's face tightened, his eyes darting downward. The room seemed to hold its breath as Crockett delivered her final blow, slow and deliberate. "Respect isn't earned by dismissing others, it's lost. And today, Senator, you've shown the nation just how quickly it can vanish." The chamber erupted, not with applause, but with the kind of hushed exhale that follows a moment too powerful for immediate reaction. Murmurs swelled. Aides exchanged wide-eyed glances. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards, already capturing the quote that would dominate headlines before the day was over. Scott sat frozen, stunned into silence. The polished veneer, the carefully rehearsed confidence, all of it seemed to dissolve under the weight of her words. Crockett, meanwhile, leaned back in her chair, not triumphant but steady, composed, as if she knew the impact of her response didn't need theatrics. It spoke for itself. It was the kind of clapback that transcended politics, a strike not just at one man's arrogance but at an entire culture of dismissal. The nation would soon see it replayed again and again, dissected in clips, transformed into sound bites, etched into the memory of anyone who witnessed it. But the ripple effects were just beginning. The exchange had barely ended before the outside world caught fire. Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's takedown spread across social media like lightning. Twitter couldn't stop replaying it. Users clipped the final lines and looped them endlessly, each repost punctuated with fire emojis and stunned reactions. TikTok turned it into a phenomenon, creators layering her words over trending sounds, reenacting the moment with dramatic flair, stitching their own applause into her speech. Facebook became a rallying cry, flooded with posts from church groups, community leaders, and everyday Americans who saw in Crockett's defiance a piece of their own story. The hashtags told the story of a movement in real time. Crockett Clapback surged to the top within an hour. Speechless. Senator wasn't far behind. Memes exploded across timelines. Scott's frozen expression plastered over captions like, "When you realize you picked the wrong fight." Even late-night hosts couldn't resist. One teased in his monologue, Tim Scott brought a smirk to a word fight, and Crockett left him searching for words that never came. Political commentators scrambled to frame the moment. Progressive voices celebrated it as a breakthrough, calling Crockett a rising force who embodied a new generation of unapologetic leadership. Even rivals, those who once dismissed her as too fiery, were forced to acknowledge her command of the room. Some conservative pundits tried to spin the exchange, but their clips were drowned out by the sheer velocity of her supporters' celebration. Celebrities joined the chorus. A-list actors tweeted praise. Musicians quoted her lines in bold fonts. Influencers with millions of followers reminded their audiences that this wasn't just a viral moment. It was a turning point, a cultural marker of resilience meeting arrogance and winning. And beyond the noise, ordinary people, teachers, nurses, students, parents, saw themselves in her. They shared the clip not only because it was dramatic, but because it was validation. For once, someone had spoken with their frustration, their dignity, their fire. The shockwaves spread outward, shaking the narrative of who gets to dominate the stage in American politics. But the real legacy of this moment goes beyond headlines, in the quiet. After the storm, Crockett's words began to take on a life larger than the chamber itself. What had started as a clapback grew into a message, one that cut across partisan divides and spoke to something older, deeper, and profoundly American. She had taken Scott's attempt at dismissal and reframed it as a lesson. That dignity always outlasts disrespect, that courage always outshines arrogance. Her strength was not in matching volume with volume, insult with insult. It was in showing that power comes from composure, from standing rooted in truth even when the spotlight burns hottest. To the millions watching, she became more than a congresswoman answering a jab. She became a symbol of what happens when you refuse to shrink before arrogance. Her response echoed America's highest values. Freedom of speech, not just for the powerful, but for every voice that dares to rise. Representation, not just as a token, but as proof that the table of democracy expands when the overlooked refuse to leave. Equality, not as an abstract principle, but as lived reality when someone like Crockett can stare down dismissal and speak anyway. People didn't just see her words, they felt them. They felt the reminder that democracy is not reserved for the polished and the privileged. It belongs to those willing to fight, to speak, to endure the smirks and still hold their ground. And as the clip replayed across screens nationwide, a truth became undeniable. This moment was not about winning a single argument. It was about reshaping what leadership looks like and reminding a country that the fight for dignity is never wasted. And that's why this wasn't just a debate. It was a declaration. Tim Scott may have walked into that chamber thinking his words would silence Jasmine Crockett, but history had other plans. His attack backfired, and her clapback became the moment no one could stop talking about. The moment that left him speechless and her immortalized as a voice of courage. What began as a sharp jab ended as a defining stand, one that will be replayed, quoted, and remembered long after the chamber's lights dimmed. Because when truth speaks with courage, arrogance has no defense. Crockett proved that dignity is louder than dismissal and that real power belongs to those who refuse to be diminished. Her response wasn't just about politics. It was about every person who's ever been underestimated, every voice told to stay quiet, every soul who knows that silence has never built justice. And now it's your turn. If you believe in voices like Crockett's, voices that rise with fire, with truth, with resilience, then be part of this movement. Subscribe, share this story, and spread it far beyond these walls. Together, we remind the world that arrogance may speak loudly, but dignity always has the final word. This isn't just a channel, it's your voice, your story, your fight.